Good morning, everyone, and welcome back. We meet again in the course on fundamental principles for Catholic bioethics, and on the program of the Masters in Bioethics here at St. Thomas University. And today we're going to finish up selection, sexual selection, and we're going to go then into adaptedness, all right? Beginning always with a little prayer in the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and enkindle in us the fire of your divine love through Christ our Lord. Amen. Okay, before we get into the topic itself, I want to review the summaries because basically, bottom line, you folks are all over the place, both in format and in content. And I want to try to do a little more uniformity, all right? So on format, I gave you this handout, which I think I had handed out the first couple of sessions, but I want to go over it again. First of all, if you could send it to me in Word, if at all possible, in Microsoft Word, all right? And the main reason for that is that typically I rearrange the left margin. I rearrange it, first of all, speaking of trees, to try to fit it into 2 pages, if at all possible. So if you give me, for example, 3 pages, I work with the font, I work with the margins. I don't fool around with the content, you know, what you put, but I try to reformat it like into 2 pages, front and back, all right? 1 sheet, front and back. And when I hand it back to you, you can see that it's kind of different. It looks different from what you send me sometimes, but the content itself, I leave intact, of course, because that's yours. All right, so still with the format then, if you could please send it to me in Word and also in the, so let me open up a Word here and show you. At the bottom here, you have these different modes. So this middle mode is the one that is for a sheet mode or paper mode. For example, that's an internet mode. You can see that it looks differently. And then this one is booklet mode, which typically splits it in half, like pages in a book. But this middle one here, right, is just the paper mode, sheet mode. All right, so that's the first thing, Word document. And then you can use narrow margins, all right, which avoids me from doing that. And then typically what I'll do is I'll rearrange the left margin to make it wider, just that one, so I can put my comments there along the way. All right, so if you notice, I try to put it there wherever I can on the page. That's as far as the format of the document itself. Please stop me if you have any questions or comments or detractions as we go along the way. Good. Okay, do you have Word? You have Word?
I do mine on outline view.
No, just use regular view, text view, because that actually gives me an outline and I have to reformat. All right, so.
Yeah, those are forced margins, and it's really hard to, if you don't do it, you know, because the standard outline has 1 and then A, you have 2 things underneath.
It indents. It indents in, even if you don't want to indent. So it's locked into Bill Gates' mentality, whatever he wants it to do, unfortunately. So try not to use outline, just regular text. And if you need to indent, you hit the tab, which pushes these in, all right? And then I'll show you where the margins are. Narrow margin is up here. So this is called the ribbon. And you can either hide the ribbon or expose it. Going on at home, there's a little clip here, the little tack. If you hit on that tack, then it exposes the ribbon, all right? And then margins are going to be in layout tab, the layout tab. Maybe turn this off for a moment. Okay, layout tab. These are tabs here. So you go layout and then orientation, all right? And then portrait, margins. This one here, and it's narrow. Now, okay? So narrow gives you 1/2 inch all the way around, as opposed to normal, which is 1 inch. That just gives you more space to fit your content in. I don't want you to worry too much about the 2-page thing, just right away, okay? And don't worry about it. If you spill over, I'll try to reformat it if possible, including sometimes I lower the point because the standard point is like 12 points. Sometimes I go 11.5 or 11. I can go down to 10 sometimes to try to fit it in a single sheet, all right? But I'll do that. Don't you worry too much about that. Okay. More important is the actual content. Well, yes, also on the top, for example, on a single line, you can give me your name, the title of the, whatchamacallit? Well, if you want to put bio 513, if you're keeping these, so that you know it belongs to this class, this course and not another course, all right? And then the actual topic of the day, so selection, variation, typically 1 or 2 words. And the date also, if you want to anchor it, but you can do that in a single line. That saves space. Most importantly, the content. You notice how I always give you some kind of an outline, and I also email that, right? I typically email it twice. I email it once before the lecture, and then I also include it after with the video, okay? And sometimes the ones that I sent with the video, try to use that one because sometimes I change it. At this point, we're on the 4th iteration of the program, so there's fairly little change to the handout itself, okay? Just keep an eye. Try to use the one that I send you with the video for your own summary. And sometimes I also attach, as in today's handout, I attach a list there of words, which these are words that come up, and I'm neglectful on this, so please catch me. When there's a technical word, either on the scientific side or on the theological side, and you don't really understand, ask me. And what I'll do is I generate a Word document in class during the lecture and write the word and then give either the meaning or some kind of an explanation. And then I'll save that one, all right? If I remember, I'll save it and then include it like this one, it's 3rd page. So it's like an addendum, okay? All this, what is the function? Because I always say think functionally, right? This all has a function. Think functionally, yeah. Thank you. It's not mine. It's part of human knowledge. But yeah, we're so used to automatically we think structurally because that's what we see. But what's going on behind the scenes is a function, okay? So to what end? The summary is to let me know what you have understood or not understood, which I know there's a level of frustration, of filtration and frustration in that you may have perfectly understood the lecture, but you just can't communicate it to me in the way that I kind of want it. All right, so there's that issue, I understand. However, in the long run, summary after summary, week after week, I get what you're trying to tell me, all right? So the important thing is the content itself. When I give you the outline, so one extreme would be to give me back the lecture almost verbatim, which would be 4 to 6 or 8 pages. That's one extreme of too much. That's not really a summary. That's, you know, the lecture back. On the other end of things, it's just basically some are just giving me back the summary essentially, which is my summary, not yours. Okay, so try to use the keywords, but then in your own words, try to redefine what's going on or re-explain in your own words. Okay, that's what I'm looking for. So that's the, actually, that's the breaking of the, that's the hardship there. To chew it over in your own mind with the video and the outline, and then give it back to me, but in your own words. And that will really tell me at what level you have understood what I'm trying to explain. You see? So that's kind of the hardest part. And again, because this is bioethics, right? Then we'll have the scientific component, which you can see I tend to go into kind of luxury of detail. And this first part of the course has been mostly scientific. But then we're going to get to the ethics, the philosophical / theological side. You also notice this has happened in every one of the 4 cohorts, which to me is a richness, is the diversity of backgrounds on the student population, all right? All the way from scientists, doctors, nurses, to I've actually had priests and deacons in the course, you know, theologians and catechists, teachers. So it's a very broad mix. And in that mix, typically some will be more versed and comfortable with the scientific side of things, and some will be more comfortable with the ethical or philosophical side of things, okay? And the idea is to try to teach to the middle, as they say. Again, I understand that the first part of this course is more on the scientific side. And so if you're not as comfortable with that language, ask, you know, comment, etc., either in class or afterwards. I'd be very happy to address it. But the content itself is what I'm looking for, all right? And kind of back in your own words, which is the challenge. At the same time, I can tell you in the past, some students have come with a laptop, typically the teachers, high school teachers, they've come with their own laptop and they download the outline, and as I'm talking, they're filling the outline. So by the time they leave the classroom, they basically have their summary. Maybe they'll review it, go over it once by looking at the video again, or maybe not. Maybe they'll read it once again, and typically by those students, by Saturday night or Sunday or Monday, they send me the summary because they actually did it during class, which I'm fine with it, all right? I also have, having said that, I could lend you I have one laptop here that I could lend you for someone who doesn't have one or has difficulty connecting, whatever. I could lend you one laptop that I have. All right, Siobhan?
Because, Father, I know on the lecture that we didn't have, I really could not get, and I appreciate your forbearance with that one. What I'm wondering is, maybe also that might help just a little bit, so you think that we are understanding?
Yes.
And I know because I was an English major, that might be easier for me to say I like an essay. Is there possibly a question or a concept or something for us to think over that we could put in the paper, in the outline, that you would feel more comfortable that we do understand the concept?
Sure, okay, so just kind of thinking out loud with you here, two things come to mind. First, feel free to do essay type instead of a summary schematic type, if that's more comfortable for you, okay, fine. You can do essays, keep them kind of short, you know, basically a paragraph or something like that. On the other one, the question, basically you could put like an exclamation, look, you could put a question mark at the end of each one of these, turn it into a question, you know, like 4 forces of evolution, question mark, which are the 4 forces of evolution? And then I give you migration, mutation, migration, and then give me a little, what does migration mean, what is mutation? That kind of thing. I hope that helps, all right? I try to make these schematic. Sometimes I go overboard, like this one is actually kind of the summary right there. But there's not much schematic here, so you kind of have to pull out from each one of these what is the key point.
So what I understand is that you want an outline, but not in like the outline context.
Right, not in outline format, but you can use the outline that I give you. For example, this is an outline, but it's an outline that's already filled out. Okay, so you would basically, as I cover these points through class, you would kind of paraphrase this in your own words. And I understand that also paraphrasing this in your own words, I tend to write synthetically. It may take a little longer, not longer, but it will be more expansive to write it in your own words. But that's fine, okay? So don't be too concerned about the 2-page thing. I usually say 2 to 4 pages. Well, again, the major points. And now I'm dovetailing with Meyer, the past 3 chapters, chapter by chapter. We actually have chapter, I think it's chapter 7 today. Yeah, because selection was chapter 6, adaptiveness is chapter 7, right? Forces of evolution was chapter 5. So I'm dovetailing with Meyer. It does help, right? Yes, and I noticed from your summaries, I noticed that you have read the text because you're using some of his terminology and kind of his flow. Okay, so little by little, remember, we still have 6 more courses to go on this, all right? But you get the gist of it. And I don't know a way out of this. I think that this is kind of the hardest of all 7 courses. If we bracket the statistics course, this is, I think it's the hardest one because it's a little, I think there's more new material here for many people that you haven't covered in this level of detail, especially in the scientific side.
For the other class, the 14?
Yeah.
Did we ever send the course?
Oh, okay. Thank you for reminding me about the 14, the 514, right? Which is responsible and professional behavior in science. All right. So a couple of things about that one. First of all, the summaries of the little chapters, paragraph or 2, about half of you have been getting me summaries. The other half, not yet, but don't leave it till the end because at this point you have about a month to do that. Okay. And so try to get me those summaries on being a scientist. Everyone has had access, either online, you can download it and print it if you want. You can also buy it. I don't know how much it costs. I think I have an extra copy. If someone wants to have a hard copy, you can see me after class. Someone had donated a copy of it, all right? If you rather deal with a paper in front of you. What else? So those summaries. Then I mentioned, in addition, there are 3 modules to do. At this point, I just haven't had the time to get into the modules and to make sure that it flows well. So what I'm going to do is those modules, you will still do them, but they're not going to be specific requirement for the course, all right? Rather, as soon as I'll be able to do that, I'll send them to you and tell you how to get into it and so forth, but probably it will be for the spring semester. Also, because the spring semester will be a little lighter in the sense that we do have 2 courses in the spring, but the first 8 weeks will be beginning of life and the second 8 weeks will be end of life.
So we're not going to have 2 classes on
Civil,
Saturday.
you'll still have,
Saturday morning and afternoon.
exactly. That's just for schedule, yes. We're not going to have that. That's just for scheduling purposes, right? So that they show up physically and they cannot conflict. But in practice, it's going to be only Saturday morning, like here. That's the standard. The first half of the semester on beginning of life and the second half of end of life. All right. So existentially, you'll only have 1 course at a time next semester. All right. Okay. That's the beauty of blended. When we have a blended course, hybrid course, we can get away with doing that. All right. So that's that. What I'm saying is that I'll be able to basically grade you on the summaries, which typically people do well, but you'll still get the module thing after the end of the actual course, the 514. All right, it will be in the springtime at this point.
And I'll be done with my book next week, so if anybody wants a hard copy, I can bring it and
Super.
have it. Maggie ordered
All
it
right.
and I used it, so if
Okay.
you want next week, I'll bring it for you.
Thank you. Yeah, we can circulate it around. Okay, that's how we teamwork. All right, anything else? Again, I've said a lot in a little time, but I think you're all getting the gist of it, right? Just a question of polishing a little bit here and there. All right, now, no further questions. The hot topic of the day is sexual selection. To a little anecdote, when I was at Purdue, working on the genetics thing, one of the courses, so typically in graduate programs, especially at the PhD level, you have to take some courses, some graduate courses, but then the bulk of it is really the research, which at the doctoral level is supposed to be original research, contributing to the field, advancing the field, and so forth. I was very fortunate at Purdue that I landed with a professor who was a real brain on genetics, but also on physics and math, Arnold Stein, he retired now. But because of that, he was very hardcore, if you will, and rigorous, and few students actually wanted to be in his lab. And typically he would only have 1 or 2 students at a time, which means that from the student perspective, you got his attention. Okay, and we made a good bonding because he was only a few years older than me. And he never had such an old student in his entire career at Purdue. You know, it's 60,000 students. It's one of these Big Ten universities in the Midwest. And the big thing there is football, which I don't care for. So I would spend a lot of time in the lab, which is really what he wanted to get. We would essentially grind out at least one scientific paper, one article peer-reviewed, and each one of those articles became a chapter in my dissertation. So typically a dissertation, a science dissertation will have 5 chapters, of which the 5th chapter is speculative, meaning that you don't have to publish it. But the first 4 were just a paper each year. And so I was able to do that in 4 years. In 4 years, I was in and out of there with a doctorate in genetics for free, by the way, because he had funding that would cover the student stipend. And that student stipend that I got on a monthly basis would not only cover tuition, it also covered room and board at the dorms where I moved in with a bicycle that I bought for $20. And that would get me to the lab back and forth. The downside is that sometimes the lab, the bacteria will grow bacteria, transform, and so forth. And the bacteria growth will be, the culture would be due at 3 a.m. on Sunday morning. Well, there goes traffic at 3 a.m. on Sunday morning in the middle of the winter snow, 2 feet of snow around me to the lab to prep the bacteria for 3 or 4 hours and then back to bed. But that's the, you know, that's the slavery that gets the work done. And he was very happy because he needed data from the lab so that he could write the article and send it out. And so what he would do, he would write the article and then send me the draft, and I would give him my input on the draft, and back and forth and back and forth. So we rounded out 1 article a year, basically, which was my dissertation. Anyway, why did I get into all that?
What was your research, Father?
He was the similarity, the relationship between the structure and the function of DNA. The structure and the function of DNA. So DNA, the structure is a higher order structure, chromatin, in interphase. We'll get more into that in the spring precisely. But the 3-dimensional supercoiling of the DNA, how it looks in the cell, all right? That is mostly shut down. I'll give you just a little preview. All of the genes are in the chromatin, in the DNA of every cell of our body. Every single gene, the 20,000 genes, maybe it's down to 10,000 genes that make up our whole body, in every single cell. But imagine if all of those genes expressed, we would be a royal mess, because we would have eyes and legs and liver and brains coming out of every single cell, because all of the genes are there for every single part of the body. And we don't. We actually coordinate into an integral system of body parts that work together, right? Which is what we call the organism, the functional organism. That means that the vast majority of the genes in the vast majority of our cells is shut down the vast majority of time, okay? And that's the supercoiling. That is so wound up that the replication machinery cannot get in there, right? Or the transcription machinery to make the messenger RNA, because it's shut down, it's wound up, all right? And some regions open up some of the time in some cells of some tissues to read, insulin for the pancreas, so that the pancreatic cells will produce insulin and not neurons, for example, all right? So you see the relationship between the structure and the function. What is keeping that DNA shut down? What is opening it in particular regions to express specific genes for those tissues and not other tissues of the body and so forth? That's the relationship between structure and function. At the higher order means at the 3-dimensional shape of the DNA, the chromatin itself, all right? So that was the research that he had been in that field for decades, actually, and published extensively in that region.
What's his name?
Arnold Stein. Yeah, and we were actually looking at regions, non-coding region, the 97% of the DNA, right? The non-coding region, to see what could be there by way of sequence that would actually determine the three-dimensional structure of the.
Like regulatory genes in a sense.
No genes, but regulatory regions. Three-dimensionally regulatory regions, and we're looking at a hypothesis. It's called the Vcg hypothesis, VWG hypothesis, that certain sequences, triplets, but with a wobble in the sequence, that is non-coding, but has an influence on the DNA, whether it's more shut down or slightly more open. That was the hypothesis. Whether the actual sequence that is non-coding, in other words, it doesn't code for any proteins, for any amino acids, but structurally makes the DNA more tight or a little less tight. That's the relationship with the function, the structure and the function. And so we would look at broad regions. We would run gels on the DNA, on genomic DNA, and find periodicity. And the periodicity anywhere between 180 to 220 base pair regions.
Those sections would be influencing the surrounding DNA by shape, or because they get transcribed by some kind of RNA that.
No, the actual shape is the actual shape. And then the question was, well, in this particular shape, is it in a coding region or not? See, you look at the ALU sequences near the centrosome is super tight. It's a humongous repeat of ALU regions, so it's very difficult to sequence that because it just goes forever. You for millions of times repeated. So how do you sequence that? Those were the challenges early on with the big sequences. We're talking a lot of biologies here and genetics language, but essentially the structure and the function of DNA was what we're looking at the big picture at the level of the entire DNA, at the level of chromatin. So we would run gels that had the entire genome, and we would get a sequence, a periodicity there. And in different regions, we give different periodicity. And so we were trying to see then, the next step was the regions that are getting a little larger, let's say 220 base pairs versus 180 base pair, right? Were those 220 regions more coding regions than not? So it was statistical, it was probabilistic. And he was a genius at that, at the statistics, and how to design the experiment to prove exclusively that that's what we were looking at and not an artifact. And I didn't have a clue, but he guided me, and I would do the research on the lab. And eventually, after the 4 years, I began to understand what he was trying to do. So that was very exciting. But what I wanted to say that in the meantime, these courses that we had to take in at the graduate level, all right, some of which were actually 400/500 courses, because undergraduate is up to 400 level, and then 500 and 600 are supposed to be masters, and then 700 and 800 are PhD. But some of the courses were 400/500, and the basic curriculum was the same, but then for the 500 students, in other words, the graduate students, there will be extra reading, a little extra something to do. But that, they synergized that way in that seniors, undergraduate seniors, could take those courses because it's also 400. Anyway, one course that was announced that was not taught by Stein, but an evolutionary biologist, was on sex and evolution. Well, you can imagine at a university of 60,000 students where there are a lot of athletes involved, men and women, that was a very popular course in the science field, sex and evolution, okay? Including myself, I signed up for it for pastoral reasons and to see what was going on, because it actually counted toward my program. And he kept going on about the evolution of sex in non-humans for 99% of the lectures. And then finally, and we're all waiting, when is he going to get to sex in humans, right? And the evolution of sex in humans. And finally, the very last lecture, so I know you've all been waiting for this moment, the human sex and the evolution of human sex. However, that topic is so extraordinarily complex and there's so many layers of complexity that I'm not covering it in this program at all. So he gave us the last lecture on mammalian sex and evolution, you know, how sex evolved all the way to mammalian, which is the most sophisticated kind of sex in that there's not only internal fertilization. First is bimodal, all right, male, female. Secondly, it's internal fertilization. But third, also internal gestation, which varies from species to species, but in general for mammals. And then afterwards, the baby is born premature because then it has to lactate, which makes us mammals, right? And so those 4 layers of complexity have really evolved because they're not found in other species that also reproduce sexually. Okay. Anyway, that was a little anecdote on sexual selection. Now let's look at it. Which is here. All right, so sexual selection involves mate choice, all right? And that distinguishes it fundamentally from natural selection. And the interesting thing is that they're both going on at the same time, you know, in nature outside of these walls. And it involves mate choice, which means it's not random because the male and the female are selecting, all right? Specifically. Now, it may be kind of subconscious, if you will, in the sense that they're following instinct, and they cannot but follow instinct. So they actually have to follow their hormones. Mm-hmm. That also distinguishes us. That's another thing that Professor Howard said in that Sex and Evolution course. The glitch with humans is the will, the free will. Okay. Which comes out, and I'll highlight that again in the spring course at the beginning of human life, because we'll review a little bit about human sexuality. Mm-hmm. But mate choice is very big, and therefore it is, we can say it's directional in that sense, even if it's hormonally driven for the vast majority of species out there. All right, so 2 general mechanisms. Again, we're at the big picture here. All right, 2 general mechanisms is on the male side, competition, and the alpha male, right? And then on the female is choosing, male choice. Mm-hmm. So we can say that the female selects, yes, in general, but the males are also selecting, if you will, by the competition. So the male is selecting on the male, and the female is selecting on the male. Okay. Very interesting dynamics. Now, the selection is going to be what? Where? On what? Right? Functionally, well, the first object of selection is going to be phenotype. See how looking at natural selection first sets us up for sexual selection. The selection is going to be, we can ask a question on what? Finish the sentence. On the phenotype, the expression. Because the idea in nature, okay, is that the phenotype generally is an expression of the genotype. So the fitness of the phenotype, the vigor, if you will, of the phenotype may reflect the vigor of the genotype, of the package, all right? It doesn't always work that way, but generally that's the idea. Mm-hmm. So let's look at some phenotypes with regards to sexual selection. The most obvious one is the dimorphism, all right? Which can be extreme, moderate, or non-existent. Dimorphism, again, remember this is the added value of the course and the program. You learn a little Latin and Greek along the way, okay? So Morphism, morph, is a shape, exactly. And the prefix di, is double, it's a reference to 2. That's where we get dos. So dimorphism is that the male and the female overall look different on the outside generally. And it's mostly a shape, a size issue. Very pronounced, for example, in gorillas, the other primates. Gorillas particularly, the male could be twice the size of the female here, as you can see. So you can tell that there is extreme male-to-male competition, right? Extreme male-to-male competition there, and the female is selecting on that because she figured literally the vigor of the largest male gorilla is supposed to represent the strongest genes, okay? Typically, it is the male that is larger, but not necessarily. Sometimes it is the female that is larger, as in these frogs here. But generally, it's the male. Or sometimes there's no dimorphism that we can tell from the outside, not being clownfish, but the clownfish can certainly tell which is male and which is female, okay? This happens sometimes in birds, sometimes in fish, many animals, that there's no distinguishing feature at the morphological level. But there will be at the physiological, certainly at the molecular, and at the behavioral level. And the fish is not important for us to determine which is the male and the female clown, but it's important for the male and the female clown to determine which is which, okay, for them. Including possibly pheromones or other hormones or chemicals that are being released from the body, which we certainly cannot sense, but they can. All right, so that's one is the dimorphism. The other one is also the coloration, the patterns. So for example, typically it's sophisticated because it's an interaction of the 4 levels, right? Again, what are the 4 levels of phenotype? The morphological, the physiological, which is functional, hidden to the eye, but it's going on, physiological, right? The metabolism. The molecular, which really takes it down to biochemical pathways, metabolism, and the behavioral, So those are the 4 levels, okay, of the phenotype. And that, for example, these are, what are these? These are the Siamese fighting fish, the Betta Splendens, right? And these are males. And they're all males, but you can see that the phenotype is quite different, quite showy. And the female is very drab by comparison, at least to us. So you can see the variation here in the morphology, of course, but also the behavior itself, how they expand their fins and fan out their gills, literally in an aggressive mode. And that's why they call Siamese fighting fish. They do come from Southeast Asia, and they're used for fighting. Unfortunately, here it's against the law because it's cruel. They'll fight each other to death. They'll rip each other's gills out, males. And that's the alpha male in nature. And so they keep their distance, and they're very territorial. And typically they will have a harem, which is the typical thing in nature, including mammals. Here you see 2 alpha males fighting, or 2 males fighting. We don't know which is the alpha yet. And 2 females. One seems to be interested, the other one doesn't seem to be interested. But maybe she's just looking de reojo from the slant of her eye. Okay. Eventually one of these 2 will win and the other one will walk away, which the Siamese fighting fish kind of is an exception because typically the males don't kill each other. They don't have to fight to death, even though it looks very impressive, okay, unlocking horns and so forth. But they just need to establish which is actually strongest, more vigorous. and then the non-alpha male will eventually walk away or run away. And even in the Siamese fighting fish, for example, and some other examples that are very aggressive, if the beta male or the non-alpha male does not go away, he risks death. But typically, there's a large enough territory that the non-alpha males can hang around on the periphery. Wait, it's a matter of time, right? Because every alpha male is going to become senile and eventually drop dead. And so then the juvenile, the potential alpha male will come into that niche.
Is there like, is there ever like a possibility where like sexual selection for animals can go like wrong or it's not normal?
Yeah, it does all the time. But again, it's not normal, but there are, the tails of the Gaussian distribution, there are abnormalities. For example, in, again, Dr. Howard was telling in the course of sexual selection there, sex and evolution, he was an expert on the frogs, the leopard frog, all right, up north. And he was telling us that typically there's an alpha male leopard frog, has a lot to do with the croaking, the singing that they do and so forth. He'd be singing away, but the alpha male gets to be so large that he has more difficulty swimming around. And sometimes the little male juveniles will be hanging at a certain distance, and they're called sneakers, because when the alpha male is not paying attention, they're smaller and more agile. They'll sneak in and quick mate, and then, or fertilize, and then leave fast before the alpha male pays attention and realizes what just happened. They're literally called sneakers. Okay, so that's an example of that. But again, statistically, that is going to be, nature has a way of taking care of that because nature never forgives, right? It could be that those sneakers are not as fit, so their progeny is not going to be, does not have the fitness of the alpha male. And that progeny will tend to get, those tadpoles will tend to get eaten more often or get more ill and so forth.
Is there ever going to be like a time, like, let's say an alpha male is like going to choose like another alpha male?
Oh, okay. So now you're talking about transgenderism, for example.
Yeah.
Okay. All right. It actually happens in fish, in some fish.
What was the question?
Like if a male would choose a male.
We'll choose another male, get confused, let's say.
Animals, yeah, are fighting, right? But they're fighting over another male instead of like two women.
Right.
Like two
Or females, yeah.
animals.
Right. It can happen. It's not the norm. So if it's not the norm, then the definition, by definition, is abnormal. All right. Without passing, and if we can translate some of that to the human behavior, but we're not passing, we never, ever pass judgment on conscience. But some people get confused, and sometimes teenagers get confused because of hormone levels and so forth, all right? But having said that, also there's a certain fluidity in certain animals on their sexual development. And it is documented that some fish, again, I mentioned that the typical, at least for vertebrates and also for insects and invertebrates, the standard is an alpha male with a harem, and then the contenders, the beta males, waiting around till the alpha male, something happens to him. In some fish, you have the alpha male and his harem of females, but then if something happens to the alpha male and there's no beta male to take his place, one of the females will become a super male, will evolve within the, will not actually evolve, but the hormones will kick in. You see, we all have, us men, we all have a little bit of progesterone. And you women, you all have a little bit of testosterone. And it has to be maintained in balance, and that actually is necessary for normal development. In fact, the two hormones look very, very similar, the double rings, okay? But they have their esters, their steroids, and they have peripheral things, atoms sticking out, okay? Those are the sites, the active sites of the hormone. But the two, the core of the hormone, the skeleton of the hormones of the progesterone and estrogen are essentially the same. Okay, they're double nitrogen rings. So those are environmental influences on those females, so that one will become the male. Okay, in other words, will start producing sperm instead of eggs that can fertilize the eggs of the other females, where he used to be as a she. Okay, so there are examples of that. There are examples of that in nature.
So it's going to become a male. It's going to transform from female to male.
Yep. Mm-hmm. In this sense, again, thinking functionally.
The generation has to keep on growing.
Exactly. Exactly. So it's a group survival thing. Male, when I'm talking about male in nature, I'm talking functionally. In other words, an individual that produces sperm instead of eggs. That's what I'm talking about. Okay?
It's going to be morphologically.
Yes, there's a morphological transformation so that the ovaries actually become testicles. Or they're gonads. So they're gonads that if they receive these gonads, if they receive estrogen, they'll produce eggs. But these gonads, if they receive testosterone, they'll produce sperm.
So it's a different being. It's not like it's going to be the same female leading the other females. It's going to be just going to transform to a male.
Okay, but it's not a different being. It's the same animal, the same organism, but now it's acting as a male. It's producing sperm instead of producing eggs.
But it's not acting because it's actually a male there.
Well, okay, I forget now what is this, maybe you can help me, Luis. What is the, I know, for example, for mammals, XX determines female, XY determines male. In birds, it's the opposite. It's the YZ, right? Is it YZ or WZ for females and YY for males, but there's still a dimorphism on the chromosome. I forget for fish what is.
There's a fluidity because in inferior animals, the comparison is not very good.
Right.
Even up to reptiles,
Correct.
Mammals and birds.
Right.
In inferior animals, you have a fluidity of sex.
Yeah, lower vertebrates. Yeah.
For example, when on the eggs of reptilians, the temperature influences, or the sunlight influences the sex.
Whether
So
that
whether
that little turtle
were fertilized already, but depending on the temperature, it developed certain other things in the genotype to become male or female. And even in the development, it's close. It's more fluid instead of discrete, as it is in birds, in mammals, more complex organisms. And in some fish, as Father mentioned, it's actually a time, like in the beginning, you are female, and eventually later in stage, one of these females becomes the male. And you don't find that differences in over time in life, like you will see in mammals or birds, which are more distinct
More complex.
from the very beginning. Exceptions in the hyenas, I think, that there's a differences that one alpha female becomes taking the role of the alpha male.
Yeah,
that is just.
but that's a that's an external. Yeah, it's a behavior, and it's also an external morphological. Because I dug into that, it seems like the hyena, the female hyena, has a penis, but it's actually a pseudopenis. It's a super enlarged and prolonged clitoris and vagina and the labia, which is very odd, but it looks like it's not really a penis. But back to the fish, yes, and I'm embarrassed to say as a geneticist, I didn't remember exactly, but that fluidity, you can see, you can have a combination of 2 X's and 1 Y to determine maleness, or actually 4 X's, 2 pairs of X's to determine female. All right, so that can change around, and there's different systems, if you will, the different possibilities.
So does that, like, I don't know if it's still on topic, but does that mean that the fishes are really distinct? Because if the way from Luis is explaining it, the way I understand it, if there's like certain temperatures or certain
Yep.
factors that
Abiotic factors can
Yeah.
also, right?
that
Mhm.
determine the sex of the
Right.
species, but is it really in the long run when you look at it, is there really a female or male?
We can say that there is, but that's the norm, okay? There's a norm. When there's a stressor on the system adapts. The group adapts, okay? They have, and that's the fluidity that Luis is talking about. There is the potential, the background. If the genotype was not there, it couldn't happen. Because again, there's no magic, okay? And there's no magic wand. It's just the potential is there because the fluidity, if you will, in quotations, is not the same. You know, some words are not univocal. They don't have the same meaning, all right? What in the transgender ideology of today, fluidity is used for in a different meaning. And I'm talking about the chromosomal fluidity, that there's a genetic basis for the possibility of some female fish turning into male. When there is a stressor that's typically could either be a biological or an abiotic factor.
You may think that happens to serve the species.
Yes, yes, exactly. So it's an adaptation. Yes, exactly. So if the alpha male, if things go normally, that will not happen.
That doesn't happen, you know, when we talk about transgender.
Exactly.
Because
Right.
if that keeps going on, you know,
Exactly.
the species is going to die.
Yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. The transgender ideology on the human is very, very different. Yes, I'll be talking about that in greater detail, and we're going to look at it at least twice. Once in the beginning of life bioethics next semester, all right? More at the chromosomal level and all that, but more at the behavioral level when we talk about the healthcare bioethics, the last course in the program. The cohort before yours is having it now, including a psychotherapist who works with transgenderism and so forth, and will give you the what is the Catholic teaching on this. So that's a very complicated issue today, and what is going on essentially is just cruelty to these children, where they're with puberty blockers and so forth. Very, very bizarre, the stuff that's going on. Very unfair.
What happened to the fish is like a mutation, or is, what will you
I don't know. I don't know. I think what happens is a silencing thing or an activation. It must be an activation thing that there must be the behavior that the lack of the alpha male stresses the pod of the harem, okay? And they sense the stress for having a sperm. Remember, it's external fertilization, right? So they sense that stress. And whichever female is capable of translating that stress into redirecting her gonads to produce sperm instead of egg. Okay. But there has to be a biochemical mechanism which I'm not familiar with.
So any fish has the capabilities of transforming into milk?
No.
I don't think it happens in all species. In fact, I would say in the majority of species, they don't. In fact, on the converse side, many species of fish and birds and other mammals, they mate for life. They're monogamous for life. And that happens also.
Like about, you know, those genes over there, you know, you can
Yep.
maybe swap
Mhm.
one to the other.
Mhm.
Just one species, or
Yes, it's in particular species. The one species that I'm thinking of particularly right now is the wrasse. Is the wrasse that occurs, we have it here locally.
Other.
Yep.
Moray eels do it.
Moray eels, yes?
Yeah, for sure. Because they're a protogynous.
Okay. Prototype.
They definitely have the ability to be hermaphroditic whenever stress arises.
Okay. Yeah, so those are, yeah, thank you. Those are true hermaphrodites, okay, and are functional. This is the blue wrasse or the bluehead wrasse. And I think they even tend to become larger than the regular alpha male. That's why it's called a super male. This one here. And this is typically the male coloration. So she will also change the coloration to be detected as a male so that the females will harem around him. Yeah, so they are, and what's that word that you use, Ada? Proto?
Sorry, I had to unmute. Protogynous, Protogynous.
Okay, thank you. So here's open. Here's a word for from homework. Proto.
Ynous.
Okay, protogynous. So here.
Right, those, because not all fish have that ability to become hermaphrodites when needed.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
Father, is it an absolute when you talk about the phenotype is sort of the outward expression of the genotype? Is that an absolute? Because this would imply that it's not quite.
Again, repeat the statement that the phenotype is the outward expression of the genotype. Yeah, generally, right? Remember, again, let's look at genotype and phenotype because these are key concepts. We know the genotype, right? The DNA sequence, the coding region, and so forth. Diploid because some can be dominant genes and some can be the same gene could have a dominant, one copy dominant and one copy recessive. But so what's the first level of expression? At the molecular level, get into functionally with the mind's eye, get into that cell, get into that nucleus. The protein is the first level of expression, right? So that's the first phenotype. But that's very far away from my actual height or the color of my eyes and so forth, okay? That protein needs to express and needs to typically, there will be regulatory proteins that trigger certain glands to produce certain hormones, growth hormones, whatever they are, to elongate the femur. So you see so many pathways in between from the genotype and even from the mRNA out the cell, out the nucleus, to the first protein that is produced from that sequence, to the actual phenotype that we see externally. Many, many pathways, and typically some time, days, weeks, months, or years have gone by before that phenotype actually expresses, right?
And then when is I'd say the sexual identity, but determined at what level?
Good question.
So if the phenotype is, if you're way down at the basic, it's the protein is at the base, and that's the first expression of the proteins. At some point, does the phenotype that's eventually expressed match up to the beginning phenotype? Because when you're talking about lower animals, you know, being transgender, I'm not really sure why that couldn't. I don't want to say a mistake, but the final expression becomes different. That the expression is not what the genetic type is, or the bottom line is
what went wrong and when did it go wrong? Yes.
So I don't know what went wrong.
Well, you know, if the phenotype is not expressing the genotype, something went wrong somewhere along the way.
Or maybe it is.
Yes.
Or it's not being allowed to express a real genotype.
Right. Okay. Without getting too much into the next semester's course, which is barely a month and a half away, we're going to look at the development, the embryonic development of the human, all right? And the bottom line here is that essentially by the 8th week, the 2nd month of the 7 months of pregnancy, all of the major organs are already formed. So differentiation, not only cellular, but tissue and organ differentiation happens within the first 2 months of pregnancy by the 8th week, all right? And so every major organ is in place, but in miniature because the little embryo is only about 1 inch long in the human. And that's when it changes name precisely from embryo to fetus, technically, except for the sexual organs, which take almost another month to the 11th or 12th week. And so they are gonads. They are undifferentiated gonads. That's at the glandular level. At the genetic level, those gonads are either XX or XY. They're formed by tissue that is either XX or XY. Okay, so at the genetic level, those gonads are either male or female. But the gonads themselves, as a gland, are not differentiated yet. It depends. If they receive testosterone, they'll differentiate into testicles. If they receive estrogen, they'll differentiate into ovaries. All right? And that, for some reason, is a little later than the development of all the other organs of the body. And so you can see there that these gonads then need to differentiate. That's why I say they're layers. Okay, it's like an onion. You have all these layers, and the more you peel it, the more you cry, because layers of complexity. The first layer is going to be the genetic layer, the XXXY. All right. The next layer is going to be at the hormonal level, and then all those need to express correctly. Then it's going to be at the glandular level, and those glands themselves will produce what we know as the primary and the secondary sexual characteristics of every animal. Right? And then we have to wait a few more months and years and decades until those organs actually become functional. And then a few more decades to see if those organs are functional enough to produce fertile offspring. So now we're talking 2 generations. So what all started with the XX or XY has now turned into functional adults, which biologically is defined, capable of reproducing. So necessary layers, but in themselves not sufficient. We have to go through the whole programming to see the functional adult. Okay? Interesting. Okay, so we're only on slide 3 or 4. Oh, no, we're down. Okay, good. So you can see, back to what's involved here is what I'm just trying to point out, the layers of complexity. If there's mate selection, what is the female selecting on? Selecting on phenotype, right? Well, the phenotype is these 4 layers of complexity. The morphology, the physiology, the molecular, and the behavioral. And the male the same, all right? So all of that is going on in all animals. Plants also. Again, I talked about plant behavior. For example, attraction to light by the shoot, and attraction to gravity by the root system, and so forth. Okay. But then when we get to the human, everything changes, because who's selecting on who? And if we're honest about it, this is dating me because I'm a disco boy from the 70s or whatever, the 80s. And I also remember the Beatles. Yeah, 70. You and I both remember. Was, staying alive. Okay, so you see who's selecting on who. If we're honest about it, the women select on the men and the men select on the women. Both. It goes both ways, right? And we're selecting at all those 4 levels and more. So it gets very, very complicated for the human.
With all due respect, that's true in a perfect world. Okay, that's not true in the real world. It's not true in society. It's not true throughout human history.
Okay, so tell me what's happening existentially.
You think about rape. You think about.
Oh yeah. Well, of course.
But
the will, the human will.
Human will, power, and how.
Yes.
Civil.
Arranged marriages.
Arranged marriages.
Which is probably, let me bracket for a moment, that arranged marriage is probably the most common and predominant, simply because it's occurring in places that have most of the world's population. Even though, it's awkward to say that's the norm, but that is the norm, simply by volume, by number. So we have a lot to go, right? We have a lot of things to do.
But that implies a selection, not at the level of the individuals involved, but
at the family level,
society,
and social,
level. So
cultural.
It's driving some selection as well, and some sexual.
There's some benefit to it.
Yeah.
Theoretically, there is a financial benefit, a land, a power. There's a power.
There is.
Cultural.
Staying within the clan and so forth, even to the point of biological detriment. Look at Tay-Sachs in Ashkenazi Jews, for example. Tay-Sachs disease and hemophilia for the royal crown of the Russians, of the czars, right? So yeah, and in Spain, the jaw kept pronouncing more and more because of the inbreeding of the Spanish royalty. So yeah, but there's a human will somewhere, at least from the part of one of them.
But are just in any other species, do we see essentially coercion, rape? That seems a blind attraction.
No,
There doesn't seem to be a real power dynamic.
It's instinct, and it can be a little violent, all right? The alpha chimpanzee tends to be pretty violent. And in fact, even the beta, if once the male has mated with the female, he wraps around her body and squeezes the eggs out and then fertilizes with smelt, because it's external fertilization, right? Got to get the female out of there because he will continue to aggress her and could kill her. They go for the gills, all right? So the female has to be taken out. In nature, of course, she'll run away and hide underneath some little plants or whatever is down at the bottom of the pond, okay? But in nature, including the human, the underlying is going to be the hormones, the sexual hormones and the pheromones, all right? The only difference, the big difference, is that for animals, that's all they have, is the biochemical signaling, and therefore it's all on instinct. Whereas in the human, there is the free will, there's the will that engages, at least on the part of one of the two, okay? And you talked about rape, which is an abhorrent behavior that we need to fight it, and always. But it's a will on the part of one, you know. Now, having said that, the chimp, which is the closest to us, and as I mentioned, genetically about 99% homology with our genome, the female has developed a behavior that allows herself to be mounted outside of estrus, outside of ovulation, okay? And that's because the male chimp is also very aggressive and is constantly trying to mount her and bites her and harms her. So we cannot say that it's rape technically because they don't have free will as we do. But the female has realized that if she gives in, even outside of ovulation, she essentially is draining the male of the testosterone. So she'll have a break for a few hours or a few days. And they may even take turns in the harem of the female chimps to drain the male, even when they're not ovulating, so that this male will calm down a little bit, okay? So, but that's an acquired behavior. And there's some evidence that the mothers may teach that kind of behavior to their daughters as they grow in the pod, in the clan. Very interesting, but it's still instinctive. It's still instinctive, okay? Very different from the human female, the woman accepting the man voluntarily outside of her ovulation, which is 75% of the time of the month. All right. Actually, ovulation, strictly speaking, is only one day. The egg, the human egg, is only fertile, mature for 24 hours on average. So out of the cycle, which is a lunar cycle of 28 days, the woman is infertile 27 days out of every month. And there could be millions of sperm around. She's not going to get pregnant because the egg is either not fertile yet or is over-ripened.
But from my understanding, and I could be wrong, the sperm can live more than 24 hours.
Yes,
and so
up to 5 days.
Yeah,
So be careful. Exactly. That's why we have to tweak it.
All the sperm are still there. Right.
That's why we talk about a week.
There's a bigger window than
Sneakers. even if the man is gone, his product is still around. Exactly. So yes, and we'll get into NFP. We'll talk about all this in more detail. Natural family planning. But basically here, I just want to point out that there's an extremely complicated selection process going on, and you know that even better than I, because I think most of you are married, and so you know what that is all about. Finally, and At the end of the day, it's about the will, which is the two-edged sword, but that will can be taken for the good and actually allow for that marriage to flourish in the way that God really wanted that marriage to flourish, you know, when it is a vocation. All right, finally, runaway selection, which is a runaway sexual selection, but it's a particular subcategory, if you will. And what's happened here is that the female has essentially become fixated on some phenotype of the male and is locked in there. But it's a fixation that is insatiable, a little bit like eating, you know. They say that, for example, you can feed a fish to death because the fish don't know when to stop eating. Because in nature, yeah, and they blow it up like this, right? If you have little guppies, you go around with a big belly. Because in nature, they never have that much food. And they're always hunting, yeah, but they'll extend their intestines if you feed them too much. Well, here what's happening is a kind of a poor analogy, but here what's happening is that the female has an insatiable appetite for the fixation, the phenotypic sexual fixation that she's walking into. In the case of the male, is obviously the fan-shaped tail, but not only that, not only the fan-shaped tail, but the whole composite, because when she's looking at the male head on, what she's seeing is the background, the fan tail is actually the backdrop of the body, the neck, the iridescent blue that is in the middle of that background, okay? And further, it's also behavioral, because what is the male going to do with that fan tail? He's going to go and shake it like that, all right? So there's a lot of vigor that is demonstrated in this to the detriment of the male. Because now imagine this male flying away from a tiger or a bobcat that is after it. Going to get caught in the branches. So at one point, vigor is too much vigor. It's excessive to the detriment of the male. Okay, so the alpha male has gone down the tubes because he became too alpha. But the female is fixated on the biggest display that she could possibly find, all right? So that's called runaway selection. Runaway selection. And the danger with that in nature is that it could lead to extinction, at least of, we wouldn't call it extinction, but it could make that particular population disappear. All right. It happens not only in birds, it's very typical of birds, not typical, but it can happen with birds precisely because of the added advantage that they have for flight. And the phenotype at some point can interfere with that flight, all right? Literally escaping from a predator. It happens also in insects. So the male becomes flamboyant or exotic. And as you can see here with this horn, which has no purpose at all other than attracting the female. But it's cumbersome to get around because, again, functionally, where do you put the beetle? On the ground, in between the weeds and so forth. So this is cumbersome to get around. Whereas the female has no problem because he's not selecting her, certainly not on the antlers or whatever structure she has, okay? All right. So that's it for sexual selection. Not too painful, but we got through it, all right? And you can see the big item here in contrast to natural selection, right? Because we're contrasting sexual to natural selection. It's the whole issue of choosing that is directed, it's the direction. But even that directional is kind of, in the rest of nature, is subconscious in the sense that it's all instinctive. It's all geared by hormones at the end of the day. It can be very sophisticated, like the dance of even mammals, all right? But that sets us apart, what's outside of the wall to what's inside of the wall, with the free will, which ultimately, theologically, we believe it's a gift from God, okay? Therefore, in principle, it's a good, and it's an exceeding good, because in the exercise of that free will, one way or another, when we align it to God's will, to the divine will, well, that's our ticket. That's our ticket into sainthood, into eternal life.
We tend to anthropomorphize.
Yes.
What happens with animals?
Yes, and we have to be very careful. And entire empires have been built on anthropomorphism. Thank you. Let's talk about this for a moment, just to leave it at this.
Like in the chimp, you would think that it's raping the female. It's an acquired behavior.
Exactly. Anthropomorphism.
And natural. It's instinctive.
Exactly.
For us, there's a lot of.
For the female, it's a survival. Yes, yes, but that thought process, yes, and there is a thought process, of course, obviously, because they have a brain and so forth, but there's no will. There's no will as such. You know, she's kind of locked into doing that to survive. But she's not doing it out of pleasure, for example. Let me give you an example. In the humans, you know, men and women, hopefully husband and wife, they voluntarily have intercourse to express their mutual love and the bonding and so forth. It just doesn't happen outside of this world. It doesn't happen in nature. It's strictly a survival thing for the male and female chimp. You know, she's not trying to bond with him in a loving relationship. Okay, that's the big difference. So I'm giving you this. Save as. I think I put it in there already. These are little words that you can look up. Okay, yeah. Anthropomorphism, and I mentioned an entire empire has been built. Entire empires have been built on this fantasy of anthropomorphism, right, of projecting our human qualities into non-humans. Mickey Mouse. In real life, have you ever seen a talking mouse with clothing? An entire empire has been built on anthropomorphism. Yes, exactly. Persona. Right? Okay, I think it's a good little place to break, and we're gonna pick up then now on adaptiveness in the second part. Questions, comments, anything? No? People are good?
Many, but
Okay, very good. Well, it's the expanding circle, right, of light. I save that. Let's have some lights, and let's pause this. Pause. It's actually, well, I think she can hear. Hello, Ada, we have a question for you, if you can hear us. Can you hear us during the break, even if the recording is off? Maybe she stepped away. Let me just peek here. I'm going to peek for a moment, see if she's here. Oh, there she's coming back. Okay, she's coming back. Have to be careful with that little camera. Okay. Ana, can you hear us? Still haven't turned it on yet.
I hear you, I'm here.
Okay, good, thanks. Yeah, so the challenge of the remote is to try to figure out how long was the break, right? But I wanted to ask you, can you hear us during the break, even when the machine is not recording?
I hear you all the time.
Oh, you do?
Yep, all the time.
Okay, all right, good. Well, it just didn't get recorded.
You were just saying how much we missed you.
Yes. Sometimes during the break, it gets spicy.
Oh, yes, it does.
Yeah. Well, that's all part of discovery. Mm-hmm. All right, so let's go into adaptedness now. There, okay. And just record it. So that's the handout there. We're up to chapter 7 of Meyer, which we're not going to cover all the chapters, but you're welcome to read them all if you wish. And in fact, for the human evolution part, we're going to go into a more recent text, Bartow and Associates, and I'll give you that handout. So this adaptedness, instead of adaptation, it may be a technical thing, but Meyer makes a distinction. Instead of talking about adaptation, he likes to talk about adaptedness. In other words, that it's a dynamic thing, but when we look again out the window on the other side of the wall, we see that all animals and plants and fungi and bacteria, whatever organism we're looking at, seems to be adapted to their environments. And in fact, at first sight, at first blush, as they say, they would seem to be perfectly adapted to their environment. So that the animals that are flying, they have wings, and the animals that live in the water, they have gills, and everything is functioning peachy keen and honky-dory, as we used to say back in last century. But when you start looking at more detail, these adaptations are actually, they're functional adaptations, but they're not as perfect as we may think at first, right? There's always a historical baggage that each organism is carrying, that each species is carrying a baggage that is reminiscent of ancestors. And so that not only are there certain structures and functions, mostly structures that are kind of irrelevant to the behavior of that organism, of that species, but even the functional adaptations are not ideal. They could actually be better for the particular niche or habitat that they're inhabiting, okay? So we can see at first sight, well, the animals living in the ocean, they have gills to breathe with and fins and so forth, and they have a hydrodynamic body. So that seems to be perfectly adapted to water style. Whereas birds, as they fly, they have these wings. Others that crawl around, they are tetrapods, so they have forward legs and hind legs and so forth, and the general orientation of the body is also forward. For us, we are bipedal, which frees up the hands for doing other stuff, as you can see, going shopping. And even marine mammals seem to be perfectly adapted to breathing from the surface in spite of the fact that they live all the time immersed in water. Okay, so when we look at further detail, I'm mentioning that it's not as perfect as it may seem, but we have to get into the detail. For example, in order for gills to work properly, not only do they need water to go through the gills, they actually need oxygenated water. If the water is deprived of oxygen, that fish will die, will asphyxiate to death, literally, even if the fish is immersed in water, okay? That water needs to be oxygenated, meaning that O2, diatomic oxygen, gas, O2, the identical gas that is in our air that we're breathing now, has to be dissolved in water. We have a gas dissolved in liquid, all right? And so that's a particular challenge there at the physical and chemical level, that this water needs to be oxygenated. The fish does not oxygenate its own water, but rather depends on it. And where does the bulk of oxygenation happen for water? At the surface, because the surface tension needs to be disrupted to mix in, literally, is like a giant spoon or blender that is mixing in the gas oxygen and other gases in the water at the surface, at the interface precisely between water and air. And so ultimately, fish and marine life, except for mammals, depend on the mix of the surface. They depend on tides, currents, and waves, and the breaking of the waves at the surface, which is the very thin layer of the entire water column, which could be 1 or 2 miles down. All that water needs to be oxygenated for the fish to function. So those gills are not as perfect as they seem. They need, sine qua non, oxygenated water. Secondly, the water needs to flow through the gill. That means that the fish mostly needs to be swimming all the time, including when they're sleeping, which they don't have eyelids either. And so they kind of have to swim around unless they are in very rich oxygenated water. They also have a pumping mechanism. The fish have developed a pumping mechanism to move the water through, but that water has to move through the gill in order for the thing to function. all right? And this gives you percentage of oxygen as it moves through a capillary between a vein and an artery. The transfer, because even at the level of detail, that oxygen has to move by simple diffusion into the bloodstream of the fish. Diffusion of oxygen, which means from a higher concentration to a lower concentration passively, so there's no ATPs involved or no energy. And so there has to be a gradient through the capillary, every capillary of every blood vessel of that gill. What that does functionally, it is increases the surface area tremendously. So if we were to spread out hypothetically, and this can be done mathematically, of course, with modeling, every capillary in the gill system, it would cover, I don't know, a huge surface, much larger than the actual fish that carries that gill, much, much larger. So that the oxygen itself can move passively through that membrane, the capillary, into the bloodstream. So imagine all the restrictions and constrictions that are involved in that process at the physical and the chemical level, including gas loss and so forth, okay? But at the end of the day, it works. It works. Right.
When you said the water had to be oxygenated, does the water already have oxygen in it?
Because it's a gas and it is in solution, so it could in principle stay there indefinitely, the oxygen. But when you leave water standing for a period of time, eventually that water becomes stagnant. What does stagnant mean? At one level, it means that it's losing its oxygen little by little because it's oxygen gas. It's diatomic oxygen, O2. So naturally, that oxygen tends to flow out because by passive diffusion, it will tend to flow out. I have to correct myself here because offhand, I don't know where it's more concentration of oxygen in air or in water. Well, naturally it would be in air. So it would tend to stay in, yes. But one thing that we don't see that's in here right now is all the microorganisms that are also using that oxygen because they need to metabolize. And so the microorganisms that are in here are depleting the oxygen of this water. So that just sitting there, it will eventually become stagnant. It will be depleted, deoxygenated. Mm-hmm.
Plus, it will naturally move from the liquid to the gas. Because the atmosphere is gaseous.
Yes.
So for gases, they tend to stay out of liquid.
Yes. Right.
Into the gas.
Because they take up, again, remember the gas takes up the size, the volume of its container. And so again, passive diffusion, molecules are expanding here.
The liquid squeeze out the gas.
Also, so the bottom line, and that happens with ponds, for example, if the ponds are not moved, that water becomes stagnant. And it could cause the death of the fish in there. That's one reason why they're putting these fountains in the little lagoons and these little lagoons that we have in developed areas, urbanization, is to keep that surface moving also and to prevent mosquitoes from putting their eggs in there and so forth, the larvae. So it has several purposes, but one of the purposes is to oxygenate the pond so that the pond can stay alive and not become stagnant and die. Yeah. Okay, so just pointing out details of how what seems to be in general an ideal structure for living in the water, for example, is gills. At the level of detail is that gill is very constrained, and it could have possibly been another system that was more functional than this. Okay, actually a lot of structure and a lot of energy goes into the fish obtaining its oxygen or resources. We can make the same argument for the birds, right? Because they fly, their skeleton, which is an internal skeleton, needs to be lighter. Otherwise, the bird will not fly. In fact, the bird is very lightweight. And the skeleton is light because it's hollow, more hollow than normal bones, much more hollow. It has this reticulate shape, structure inside, and so it's more prone to breaking. That's the downside. Okay, their skeleton is more brittle, more delicate, because it's lighter, it has less calcium. It's more porous that way.
But at some point then, like with birds that can't fly, do they eventually, I mean, I'm thinking, yes, the dodo didn't fly, I don't remember, but.
And many of the, so again, adapted then, no? Adapted to a particular niche. There are many birds, mostly in Australia and sometimes in Africa also. The moa, the rhea, the ostrich, all those, right? Kiwi, because there were no carnivores in Australia originally. There were no carnivores, so they have no natural predators. And that's why the marsupials were also able to thrive, even though it's a very precarious lifestyle, because that marsupial embryo fetus has to come out and be born really prematurely and needs to latch on to the little nipple that's inside the bag. We'll get to that example in a minute. But anyway, you're looking at a super adapted bird that had no need of flying because it didn't need to flee from anything. There were no predators.
So it's not as highly evolved?
Sorry?
You wouldn't think it was as highly evolved if it couldn't fly? Or did it fly at one point?
No, but it's a secondary evolution. In other words, the ancestors of the moa, the rhea, and the ostrich and the kiwi had wings, but they became degenerate because lack of use. All right. Yeah. Similar to the hip bone of whales and cetaceans, sea mammals, right? And penguins to fly. Yeah. Yeah, the penguin definitely, because yes, they become degenerate, functional for where they're living. But you can see it's a secondary adaptation. Meyer also makes that point that the basic body plan evolves first, or actually not evolve, but develops first. And then the secondary characteristics, or the more detailed characteristics, develop later in development. Okay, so there's a basic body plan structure that develops first, and that we inherit from these common ancestors, so that a part of that basic body plan may no longer be functional or have an advantage to this particular species in their niche, in their habitat, all right? But it's a remnant of the common ancestor. Other disadvantages, for example, in the reptiles. So I have examples mostly about vertebrates here. Okay, remember the 5 classes of vertebrates, right? We have fish, amphibians, reptiles, birds, and mammals. Okay. So for many reptiles, because they are cold-blooded, in other words, they do not retain body heat. Of those 5 classes, the 2 that are warm-blooded, endotherms, are the mammals and the birds, mostly because of hair, or a super adapted hair, which is the feather. Again, keratin, mostly the same, is protein and so forth. But the lower vertebrates, fish, reptiles, amphibians, they don't hold on to their heat. They're not endotherms, they're exotherms, which means that they need to receive heat from the body, from the environment. And so they have this typical behavior of sunning themselves, especially reptiles, right? Which are totally on land. And they need to sun themselves. As you can see here, this iguana taking a nap in the Caribbean. And yes. But this is more exposure to UV, which is a mutagen. So that's a disadvantage of having to sun oneself, is more exposure to UV, okay? So it's not ideal, the reptile, and that's why they have developed scales and so forth to protect themselves from that excess exposure to ultraviolet radiation. Another example I wanted to give with regards to the knee for mammals in general and the human in particular. We have a forward bending knee, and it seems that birds have a backward bending knee, much more efficient. They have been designs, there have been models done with the human, with the weight of the human and the motion of the human and so forth, if you put the same body of the human with a backward bending knee, it's much more efficient. Yes, we could actually spring forward, and you know what, you notice it? Not going up or going down steps. Have you noticed going up steps is fairly easy for the human? We just lean forward a little bit because the knee bends forward. But going down steps is more difficult. And for the elderly, that's a typical fall, going down steps. We're not as sure because we're bending forward. If we were bending backward, we'd negotiate going down on steps or going down on hills much easier. Much more easily. The hip will be better distributed, the upper body will be better distributed on the hips and so forth. Those are models that have been done with computers. And in fact, we see that birds are very efficient in walking or jumping with their backward knees. Secretary bird? Yes. Thank you. It's a secretary bird. Yes, it's a raptor. It's from the family of the eagles and falcons and hawks. Yeah. From Latin America? It's Latin America or Africa? I forget. It's Africa, secretary? No. Yeah. No. It's that's the norm. It's not a mutant, it's a norm. Yeah? Yeah. They're pretty, yeah. Yeah, look at that. That's beautiful. That's typical of the male. Look at that aggressive behavior. Yeah. Interesting, yeah? Oh, he is, because Dr. Keha is an ornithologist in his spare time. Oh, yes? Really? No kidding. Wow.
Some of them, they know that, so they stand still.
Ah.
They will not be seen by the bird.
Look at that behavior. Yes, he chases some movement. Yes, amazing, huh? Wow. Look at that. Secretary bird fighting a cobra or a snake. Yeah. Okay, so I'm using this fellow as an example of a seemingly backward bending knee, but it's not really the backward bending knee. Birds have a forward bending knee, is that we don't see the knee. What we're looking at here is the ankle. Watch this. Here's a skeleton of a bird and a human. We have the hip up here, right? And then the femur, look at where the femur is. So this is our femur that extends beyond the hip out into the leg, right? But in the bird, the femur is embedded inside the body. So that the sternum, which is this, is literally, the femur is embedded inside and the sternum is beyond the femur. So the first bend is here, okay? That's the first bend. So the tibia, which is the lower bone of our leg, which is subdivided, has a little sliver of bone in the back, is what looks like the femur of the bird. It looks like the femur. Here's a pigeon, but it's not. It's the tibia, actually. So this, what seems like the knee of the bird, is actually the ankle of the bird. And this is the tarsus, only one tarsus left out of the complex of tarsi that we have, right? And then the metatarsus are the toes, just like the hand, the carpus, the metacarpi. All right, so really what we see as what seems like the lower leg is the tarsus, only one left. So imagine all the degeneration that has gone there. Again, for streamlining the skeleton and just keeping the essential bones that are needed for flight so that that skeleton of the bird is not as heavy. So they don't really have a backward bending knee, even though functionally it acts as if it were backward bending knee, functionally. But structurally, it's actually the ankle. Extreme adaptation, huh? Okay. Other examples of adaptation, of adaptedness, right? When we look at, these are the 5 classes of vertebrates that I've been talking about. We have the mammals, we have the birds, reptiles, amphibians, and fish. Common characteristic, a skeleton, an internal skeleton. So that's the basic body plan, internal skeleton, calcified. But then at the level of the developed organism, a large variety of functions for that internal skeleton. Because in the fish, that internal skeleton serves for swimming. In the amphibian, in the adult, serves for jumping around, okay? In the reptile, serves for crawling and slithering. The mammal, tetrapod, again for walking around, and in the fish for flying. So you see the same basic body structure and internal skeleton has taken on many, many different functions according to habitat, niche, and habitat. Okay? Adaptiveness. Every organism that we see seems to be perfectly adapted to their environment, but in reality, they're not. When we look at the detail, they carry this baggage from the ancestor that makes them adapted enough to survive. Adapted enough to survive. Of course, vertebrates, we don't have the exclusive on this. It also happens with invertebrates. For example, the arthropods. Arthropods are the ones that have articulated legs or articulated appendages. Again, little Latin, pod, podia. Podium, podia is a leg, like the podium. It's supposed to be a huge leg to stand on. All right. Arthro is articulated, like arthritis is the itis, is the illness of the joints or the articulation. So arthropods are those animals that have jointed legs or articulated legs, typically known as lobsters, crabs, millipedes, butterflies, crickets, beetles, all of these crunchy fellows. They also have an exoskeleton, right, which is mostly made out of chitin or keratin. It's the proteins, but they're hard. So that also means that they have to molt periodically and crawl out of their skeleton, discard the skeleton, and grow a new one. And in that few hours or maybe a couple of days that they are in the molting process, have discarded their exoskeleton or the old one, the new one is still soft. And I don't know if you've ever had soft shell blue crab, but that's where they come from when they're molting, okay? And you eat the whole thing because the skeleton is still soft. It hardens with the calcium in the water and so forth, and the chemical reaction that happens on the shell. And so they are also adapted, and they are adapted for their particular lifestyle. You can see they also cover land, water, and air, the 3 basic media where we can live on this earth. Also, we can look at the wings, for example. We can say there's a general phenotype of the wing, which is going to be expansive and somewhat curved to allow for the air underneath the wing to move faster than the air on top of the wing, and that keeps the bird and the airplane floating or traveling through a medium, which is a fluid. Air is also a fluid. It's a much lighter fluid than water, but it's a fluid. So fluid dynamics apply to it. But within that general structure of the wing, all right, which functionally is designed so that the air moves faster underneath and on top, thus lifting the animal. Within that general structure of the wing, there's a great variety of wings. Adaptedness, depending on the lifestyle of the bird, whether the bird is a little bird that is flying from twig to twig, or a cormorant or an albatross that will spend 6 to 8 months gliding or flying from one continent to another, all right? And within the wing, the great variety of feathers also, depending on where that feather is on the wing, the particular shape. Form follows function. The structure of the feather is according to the function of the feather. All right? So again, structure of function. Other examples, this not only happens in the animal world, where it's perhaps more obvious to us, it happens in the plant world, so that not all plants are alike. Even though they seem to be more similar to us, there's a great variety of plants, and each plant is adapted in nature to where it is living, to that particular habitat. All right? So, and down to the area of the general and specific adaptation. General adaptations come in first, and they're shared by a larger group of animals or plants or fungi. And then specific adaptations, again, is shared by a smaller group of species. I want to point out conifers, for example, contrasted to what we call deciduous trees. Yeah, conifers have needles instead of leaves. They have cones instead of flowers, and they have tap roots instead of secondary roots. Again, conifers or pine trees, they have needles instead of leaves. They have cones instead of flowers. That's their reproductive organ, it's the cone. And they have tap roots as opposed to secondary roots. Now, non-pine trees, non-conifers are called deciduous trees, okay? Because they shed their leaves, deciduous. But the main point here is that conifers are adapted to their particular environment. Where do we find conifers typically? We say up north, yeah, well, right outside, yes, we have the slash pine here, which is super adapted to a subtropical climate. But the typical climate of conifers is up north, or rather cold. It could be way down south also, or up the mountain, but it's a cold region. Typically where it snows for several months during the year. And the weather and the temperature is also very low. So let's look at a couple of adaptations. Needles instead of leaves, because a leaf would accumulate a lot of snow, and snow gets heavy. That's why roots collapse sometimes, right, with a lot of snow, because it's water, and water is heavy. So by having a needle instead of a leaf, it accumulates actually very little or practically no snow. So that's a super adaptation to have a needle instead of a leaf for snowfall. Cones, it protects, is much more hardy. Imagine a flower, imagine a tender flower like a rose or an orchid or something like that in a snow region, it's gonna get burnt because it's delicate tissue, which by the way, notice that the flower are themselves super adapted leaves. Flowers are the different structures of the flower, including the stamen and the pistil, which are the actual reproductive organs. Those are adapted leaves. It's amazing. Their origin is actually leaf tissue, if you will, precursor. All right, but the cone is hardy and it's closed most of the time, and then there will be male cones and female cones. So these are the typical female cones are largely like that. And then each one, inside each one of these scales, these are scales inside at the core, right, will be typically 2 eggs, 2 ova, which are waiting to get fertilized by what? By the pollen. So then there was a counterpart. I should find a male, I'll show you here. That's why we have the internet. The male cones are much smaller and fuzzy, if you will, okay? And they put out a lot of pollen. This is a female cone, but these are male cones, smaller and fuzzy. Here's one that has both. Here's one that has both. It looks like the slash pine. That's the female cone there. That's the male cone there. Okay, and the male cone's purpose is to put out all this pollen clouds, billions and billions of pollen grains. Those are going to fly around. There's a little arachnid spider there. anyway, that pollen is going to get in here and it's going to fertilize. In fact, the pollen has 2 sperm cells inside, all right? One, the first sperm nucleus will make a tube, and then the second sperm will go down that tube and fertilize the egg. So there's fertilization, sexual fertilization in plants also. And I'll point out, I think I pointed out before, some conifers, depending on the species, for some species, you will have a male tree and a female tree, which are distinct, meaning that the male tree only produces male cones and the female tree only produces female cones. So you have sexual dimorphism, if you will, for some conifers. Other conifers, the same individual tree will produce both male and female. So those true hermaphrodites, functional, including the slash pine here. So they produce both, as you can see here in this photograph, the female cone and the male cone both in the tree. So the tree as a whole is neither male nor female, it's both. So it's at the level of the sexual organs. Okay, so the cone is adapted again for the harsh winter and so forth. But even what we don't see underground, which is the root system, typically conifers or pine trees, they have a taproot, a main taproot that is constantly being pulled by gravity. And so it tends to go deep, 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 right? And sometimes because the top layer here could be permafrost, could be icy, or it could freeze in the winter. So the idea is to go deep with the roots. Sometimes the root system can be 2 to 4 times the size of the shoot. The shoot is what is above ground, right? Shoots up, and the roots are below. Many of the conifers, the root system is 2 to 4 times larger than what we see than the shoot system. So for example, when we see the slash pines that go three stories high, well, the roots down there could be 6 to 8 stories down. And what happens, at some point they'll hit the aquifer. Once they hit the aquifer, they're in heaven because they have a water source year round, and they have the sunlight on top and the nutrients around, so they're set to go. And that makes them the dominant species because no other tree will reach that deep down, okay? And that's mostly guided by the taproot.
Did the Australian pines get that far down?
Australian pines are not real pines, and it's a good thing you mentioned it because I'm going to talk about those creatures in a minute. They're public enemy number 1.
Very, very basic.
Very invasive, like iguanas, yeah. Why can't we have the iguanas eat the Australian pines and then something else eat the iguanas? That's the one, unfortunately.
But well, you mentioned that taproot for slash pines and many pines in general. That's one of the main problems we have here in Lake County. Some people say, well, let's plant pines back. Some landscape architects will describe that. Well, the problem is that most of what is left is wetlands. So they are filling the wetland with the developments. They compact the field so much that you put the pine trees, the young pine trees, and they cannot develop a top. They get to a point that they keep that compacted field a couple feet down, and they get stuck there.
They're too tender, they cannot penetrate.
They tend to rot over time quickly. You see that all of a sudden they start getting yellowing, very young, and they die. So in order to get pines back, you have to allow them, like in the natural limestone that we have here, that is porous, and the pine breaks it down.
We'll find its own way.
And then it's in heaven. And develop this massive,
sizes, especially.
But in the communities, they try to put them.
Right.
They're not gonna.
It's too compacted. Yes. So far, and here is this is ideal because it's sand, and we have, I don't know how many. We might have maybe 20, 30 feet of sand here.
That's okay.
Exactly. And so this is ideal for them because it's sandy, and it saturates when it rains, but then it percolates because the roots, they don't like wet feet. What is called wet feet. They don't like the roots to be in water, standing water all the time because, like you say, they rot. So it's really very well adapted to this type of environment. Okay, so you see some adaptations there, particularly of the conifers, and that makes them the dominant species. It also makes them able to maintain their needles in the wintertime, whereas the other trees, the deciduous trees, are going to have to drop their leaves because they cannot withstand. Another adaptation that is not seen here, that is internal, but is very real, they have resin instead of sap. Okay, and sap, which is the white milky substance of deciduous trees, sap has a high water content and tends to not actually freeze, but it doesn't do well in the wintertime. It slows down to a stop, and the tree goes dormant, becomes dormant. Whereas resin has very little water content and doesn't freeze and continues to circulate in the wintertime. And so that's why also they're called evergreen, because in the winter, conifers, pine trees stay green, and that's their growth advantage around the rest of the forest that has lost their leaves.
But they need less water anyway for the needles, right?
They do need less water in general, yes. And yeah, they become more hardy and more efficient that way, that the needle is sufficient for the photosynthesis that is needed. But don't be deceived, because you put needle after needle after needle and you start measuring the surface area of each individual needle, you get a humongous surface area by the time you account for all the needles on the tree. All right, similar to the alveoli or to the convolutions of the brain that is folded in and out. When you span that out, you get a huge surface area. And all that area is photosynthesized. It's all the way around the needle.
Very surface to volume ratio.
Right, yes. Okay, let's move forward. And what I'm showing you here then is all the mammals that are, you can see all the different adaptations. We have managed to conquer, if you will, all the three major environments that we have: land, water, and air. With mammals, all right, a few, this is actually a gliding, probably like a gliding squirrel, but which is not a true flyer, but the bat, the different species of bat, is a true flyer. So they actually do have wings and not just gliding areas, okay? This is just a flap of skin between the front legs and the hind legs. But the bat has actually developed wings so that the fingers, the digits, are part of the wing structure.
So that would be an adaptation for the squirrel? Like
Yep. Right, from tree to tree. At some point, that extra flap of skin worked, so it had a selective advantage. That particular squirrel that developed, that was born with that extra flap of skin between the legs, got away from whatever was going to chase it, all right? Whereas the other one that didn't have it didn't get away. So the one that got away, if it made it, got to pass on that characteristic. But the characteristic originally had to appear by chance. You know, it was exactly. It's part of the variance. It's part of the variance, okay? All right, so I want to point out marsupials and even egg laying. We have the platypus, right? And the echidna are two species that are still egg laying. Why would we have an egg laying mammal? Obviously, there's no gestation or anything like that. Well, remnant of our ancestor, which were all egg laying. And the marsupials, I'll talk a little bit more about marsupials in a minute when we talk about parallel evolution and convergent evolution. Here, this one is to show the adaptedness of all the, 28 orders of families that we have in the mammals. I forget exactly how many. All right, another point. So all these are adults, and they're adapted to their particular habitat or environment at the 4 levels: morphologically, physiologically, etc. But also, as we go in the embryonic development, you've seen this diagram before briefly when we talk about ontogeny, recapitulating phylogeny. Well, only in a very, very broad sense, not really at the level of detail. Phylogeny refers to the development or the origin of the entire group, in this case of all the vertebrates, okay? So we got amphibians, birds, mammals. So the group of vertebrates. Ontogeny is the origin of the individual. In this case, the individual group, like these salamanders, amphibians, or the individual bird, the individual mammal, pig, monkey, human. And what it's trying to point out here is that the earlier we go back, the more we look alike, the morphology, and physiology is similar earlier in development, but it's still we're at the gross morphological level, if you will. If you drill deeper into the molecular and definitely at the genetic level, we're going to find a difference already between all these 5 groups, okay? Because genetically, they're going to have the genotype of that particular species. As development goes, more differentiation happens, but we still have those vestigial structures that relate us to common ancestors, like I mentioned the tail bud in humans, and also the gill slits, whereas actual gills don't develop after that. So we're down to, yeah, the embryonic development there toward the bottom of the first page. General adaptations tend to appear first, and then more specific adaptations appear later. We all start as zygotes, whatever species, then we go through a morula stage. The cells are still undifferentiated, the different cells, and eventually we evolve into, or we develop rather, into the blastocyst or the blastula, and then move on to the embryo, fetus, etc. Another example, looking at marine animals, marine vertebrates, not only mammals like the dolphin and the whale, but also some vertebrates have gone back to the ocean, like sea turtles, for example. Their flippers are well adapted to swim through the ocean, through the water, but the lungs are less adapted to being in the water because lungs need air, not water, for breathing. And so the turtles is enslaved, if you will, to come to the surface periodically to catch a breath of air. Okay, she can exhale when she's down in the water, but it needs to come up for air to inhale. And so that restricts the turtle and marine reptiles, including marine snakes and so forth, having to go up to the surface. At some point, they could last up to several hours underwater. But at some point, they have to come to the surface. And that is a dangerous behavior, to have to depend to come to the surface, because every animal is more susceptible at the surface, at the interface of 2 media. They can get more attacked. In fact, they tend to get more attacked and caught and so forth at the surface, whether by humans or non-humans. Okay? Think of whales. When the whale is down below, no way to catch her. But when the whale comes up, the dolphin comes up, that's the danger, that's the exposure. And so the adaptation is a sufficient adaptation, but it's not, again, ideal. There's always a drawback on the adaptation. They have adapted to living in water with lungs, but they depend on that surface sooner or later. Number one. Number two, for the reptiles, for the marine reptiles, typically they need to come to shore to lay their eggs. So that's the second drawback, if you will, that they have, hindrance. Whereas amphibians, on the other hand, they lay their eggs in water. All right, moving further now by layers of complexity, if you will. Remember that we start with the individual of a species. All life on Earth is specific, and that's what we call the species. There's no generalized life. You know, there's not a blob, a living blob that is unspecific, that doesn't belong to a particular species, all right? So what I say is a little philosophical, if you will, but it has a practical application, that all life on Earth is specific, belongs to a particular species, all right? That's an important argument when we look at the beginning of human life, that at no point in that development are we not human. At no point are we not human. If we're living, we have to be living as a particular species, all right? And it's not that when we're very young, we're fish. No, that was the error with Haeckel and that diagram. the ontogeny and the phylogeny, is that we don't change from one species to another as we develop. All right, as we develop. Okay, so I'm starting with the individual of any particular species. When two or more of those individuals get together and start interacting, what do they form? Population. But, and again, the population, at least in biological terms, is very specific, and it means that literally it's only of one particular species. Okay, we see population of two types of fish, then what we have actually is two populations that may be interacting, but they're two different species. Okay, so when we have two or more populations interacting, obviously when we say two or more populations, already I'm including that there are two or more different species that are interacting. We have what is called a community, all right? A community. So we're trying to get as realistic as possible to what nature is like. So really, we don't just have individuals floating around in thin air. We naturally have normally populations. Those populations, again, are not isolated. Typically, populations are interacting with each other to form communities, all right? That is necessary, but still not sufficient to define the natural environment. Because up until now, I've only been talking about living things, right? Plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, etc. But again, we don't live in a vacuum in the middle of the universe. We're actually inhabiting an Earth, which beyond the biotic factors of communities, there are also the abiotic factors, the non-biotic factors. So when we add the non-biotic factors to the mix, to a community, now we have an ecosystem. And that is the closest that we can get to nature is what we call ecosystem. At the local, regional level, tend to be at the small, depending on the range of the population, right? And each population is going to have its own range. But the ecosystem tends to be at a local, regional level. So for example, we can talk about our slash pine ecosystem here at St. Thomas University, defined by the 300 trees that live there, the 300 slash pines and all the interaction. And that's what I've shown here. This is an ecosystem of a deciduous forest. So there is deciduous, all right? Looks like it's going into the fall season for the turning of some of the leaves. And we have, so this is attempting to represent an ecosystem in North America, a broad swath of middle of the United States, if you will. Many animals that you can see here, all right? There's a weasel, there's some kind of a bird up here, a deer, the turkey, the bear, the, what do you call that?
Beaver.
Beaver, at least the beaver den, okay? There's a bat up here and so forth, some other bird, squirrel. But you notice what, yeah, chipmunk, you notice what is going on? Of course, this is for the sake of simplicity, but we only see one of these species, right? So it's not really populations. There's a single turkey, there's a single bear, and so on and so forth, a single deer. The assumption is that if we broaden the window and we would look beyond this particular little photograph, we would see other deer and other bears and other turkeys and so forth, where they really belong to a population, okay? So we have to, it's simplified. But not only at the level of animals, obviously at the level of plants, we got ferns, we got bushes, we got deciduous trees up here, okay? This looks like an oak, etc. And also the fungi, so don't forget the fungi as that other group. And then if we were to look microscopically, we'll see the fourth kingdom, if you will, of the bacteria. So this would be an ecosystem represented there. It's in a dynamic way because there are individuals and whole groups that are moving in and out of this ecosystem at different times of the year. And of course, all of the abiotic factors, beginning with the temperature that's there, the amount of humidity, sunlight, day, night, water availability, even pressure, how high or low it is on a mountain, et cetera, et cetera. So you can think of a number of abiotic factors that are actually making this ecosystem functional and living. The same can be, the same case can be made for the oceanic, the water column, where typically we talk about, so this would be toward the surface, in the middle of the water column, and then at the bottom of the ocean, the Benthic region. So typically the surface, or especially along the coast, is called the littoral region. We'll look more at this when we get to the environmental course. But we have the littoral region, then we have the pelagic region, it's in the middle of the water column. Many, many animals live there, and some plants, especially algae. And then the benthic region is the ocean bottom of the ocean floor. Each one of those creatures, plants, animals, bacteria, fungi, etc., are adapted to their particular environment, all right? So this would be also marine ecosystems. We got land, we got water ecosystems.
Will they die if we go into the region?
So they all have a range. You're asking about the range, and each one of these species will have a particular range, all right? And they can certainly die either because they get eaten up or because the pressure is too much for them or too little, all right? And generally they stay within more or less within the water column in the range where they were born or hatched, because that's pretty much the pressure is a big factor in the ocean, which is much less for us out on land. On average is 1 more atmosphere pressure every 10 feet, or every 10 meters or 33 feet is 1 more atmosphere pressure. Just to give you a graphic example, let's imagine a basketball here at the surface, all right, at the surface of the earth, above the water, that by gas laws, every other atmosphere pressure, the gas shrinks to half its size. So if I take a basketball and take it down 10 meters or 33 feet to the ocean, about 30 feet down, it will be half the size. If I take it down 30 feet more, it will be 1/4 of its size. It's beginning to look like a tennis ball or a baseball, all right? But that air inside is under pressure. It's equalized at that thing. If you take it down 100 feet, it looks like a golf ball. A basketball will look like a golf ball at 100 feet, okay? 3 atmospheres. We know this from diving, right? So we have to, because the air we're breathing down there is compressed air. And that's why we got to bring it up slowly, because that air will tend to expand on the way up. And it cannot expand faster than we can release it. Yeah, we also consume it faster, yes, because it's compressed. So that's the diving table. All right, so a lot of exciting thing here, but you're getting a picture of the ecosystem and the complexity of interaction in this ecosystem, how they're relating not only to the other living creatures, but also to the abiotic factors, all right? And I think it's a little repetitious. This is stuff that I had talked about of the adaptation, yes, that it is a general adaptation, but it is not, it could always be improved or changed, but it is adapted enough to that particular environment for that organism to survive. So, for example, a hydrodynamic shape for fish, because it's the least resistance through the water, which tends to be thick. The hollow bone of birds, the flat leaves, the leaves will naturally be like this on trees. No tree would have leaves like that because it's non-functional at all. The eye, which has developed many times in evolutionary history, will have a different lens depending if that lens is going to be used on land and through air, to look through air, or to look through water, all right? And that's the famous fish eye lenses, which are very thick because the water medium is more thick. So to be able to see, the lens has to be different. All right, now I want to talk a little bit about convergent evolution. This is an exciting thing, this convergent evolution. Toward the bottom here. These are mammals and placentals and marsupials, okay? And you notice that for some placentals, there is a marsupial equivalent. So marsupials are the ones that don't have a placenta. Most mammals are placental. They have a placenta, most mammals. In other words, the embryo or the fetus, as it's developing inside the mother, inside the uterus of the mother, there's an interface, which is a very complex and dynamic structure that we call the placenta. The placenta is full of capillaries, both on the baby side, on the fetal side, and on the maternal side. It's a vital organ, but it's a temporary vital organ because it's discarded at birth, the placenta. But for the fetus and the embryo, the placenta is vital, right? Naturally, in place. Okay, so those are placental mammals, and most mammals are placental, including the human. But there are some mammals that are marsupial. The marsupius is a reference to the pouch, okay? Marsupius is a reference to the pouch. They don't have a placenta there, but they do have embryos. There's internal fertilization, and there is a partial internal gestation until that little embryo gets large enough to have all of its organs in place, but then has to come out. So the mother gives birth prematurely. And what comes out is a fetus, typically hairless, ugly looking little fetus that has to crawl on the belly of the mother by itself and find its way into the pouch, into the marsupius. And what's inside the pouch is one tit with one nipple. That is a long nipple. And what does the little fetus do? The fetus swallows the nipple. And it's like a tube to the stomach. It's an actual tube to the stomach. It's amazing. The mother has to stand there or sit there quietly, and this little fetus has to crawl on her belly up and crawl into the belly, to the marsupius, and there swallow the nipple, and then he's all set for several months until he becomes a juvenile and starts poking his head out. But he'll hang around. He'll go in and out of the pouch, or she, depending if it's a boy or a girl, male or female, until they're quite large, actually. And at some point, the mom has to kick the kid out and don't let him come back into the pouch again because it's just way too large. But he's comfortable in there. For one thing, he doesn't have to move a leg because the mom is doing all the walking, right? Or the jumping. But these are the marsupials. Okay? Now, going back here for a moment, this, of course, is a very dangerous journey. As short as it is, the mom has to lie there, just still, not move. Imagine if there's a cat or a wolf or a tiger or lion around, that mom is going to get taken down. That's the end of that marsupial, okay, including the fetus. The good thing is that where they developed, there were no carnivores, and that is Australia, and I think New Zealand also, see? So it's they had a whole continent to themselves, and so that's why these marsupials never evolved into placental. There was no need to expend the extra energy to develop a placenta because there was no need for it. There were no predators.
Mutation never happened there.
Exactly. That's right.
Do they have multiple twins or?
I don't know, possibly.
So there's only one nipple in that.
I think there's only one nipple. It may depend on the species, you know, like pigs and goats, and they have several nipples. So I don't know really. It's an interesting question. I wonder if the wallaby, the koala,
I know that sometimes kangaroos, at least kangaroos,
Yeah.
I've seen two.
Two
One
inside,
smaller
yeah.
than the other.
Oh, yeah.
Two
Okay.
generations of babies inside. And I know
Two generation or two siblings?
No, generations.
Oh, wow.
And by my house, it was a roadkill of possum,
Yeah,
and it had babies inside, several babies.
several.
So I guess that.
Okay, so she may have several nipples, yeah. Yeah.
And it was.
Oh, yeah, several.
Yeah.
They were still
because
fetal?
It was just
A hit.
hit.
Yeah.
It killed her.
Yeah,
So it wasn't like a mess.
yeah,
Just
you
when
picked
they-
her up.
I could save it and.
Yeah.
but
It was still alive?
It broke her neck.
Oh.
And the babies were alive there and I didn't know what to do. But
Right.
they are
They were still fetal. They were
Immature,
still fetal. Yeah.
Kind of
Beginning
like
to grow some
the
hair.
beginning,
Yeah.
but still.
Yes. Too young, too tender. Some people have tried little bottles, you know, the old baby bottles and so forth. But yeah. So I'm glad you bring it up because the possum, I forgot the possum is the only marsupial that is actually over here in the American continent, right? They need to go away. They hang from the trees at night. They're nocturnal. Yeah, sometimes they get into an attic and can crawl around at night.
Yeah, we had one in our garage once.
Oh yeah. Mm-hmm. Yeah, they can get aggressive and they can transmit. So they can be vectors of some
My husband
diseases.
trapped it alive and released it in the Everglades.
Oh, good. Yeah.
That actually happened twice.
Yeah.
But I've learned recently they really eat ticks.
Oh, really? Okay.
Yeah, and they say
Wow.
don't kill possums because they're not
Right.
as mean as their reputation.
Right.
They eat ticks, like that's all they eat.
Oh, wow. No kidding.
Yeah.
Oh, that's
They're very
fantastic.
good, and the Everglades are getting wiped out by the pythons. That's why
Yeah,
they
getting-
come closer to us.
Ah,
So
they're getting away from the pythons.
Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. No, they're good. They're good. Only when they're cornered. But yeah, they're the only marsupial, as far as I know, that has made it over to here, or that survives. Oh, because we have carnivores. So the break was the marsupials were around, just like the camelids, right? When the Pangea and Gondwanaland and the breaking of the continents, fragmentation, but all the marsupials did manage to live. They were out-hunted by the carnivores. I'm talking about North and South America. But anyway, what I wanted to point out is that, let's see. Yeah, the one on top is a marsupial. The one on the bottom is a placental. So this is a gliding squirrel. And there's called a sugar glider in Australia. See, they're unrelated because at this point they're millions of years away from the break of the continent. They developed similar characteristics, similar phenotype, but they are only very distantly related. They're only related at the level of vertebrates, you know, at the level of mammals. But not even beyond mammal, some are marsupial and some are placental. So imagine when the break happened many, many, many millions of years ago. And yet there's a kind of a parallel for one species marsupial and another species placental, right? Like for example, the gliding squirrel, placental, the glider, sugar glider is called marsupial. The mouse, the common mus musculus house mouse is around, and this crest tail marsupial looks like a mouse, okay? But it's a marsupial.
Genus though?
Not at all.
So
They're
how
not even the
do they-
same family. They're not even, that's a common name. You have to look at the scientific name. Mus musculos dasycercus christi cauda.
So 1, 2, 3, so they're in the same order.
No.
No, not even the order.
They're closer to the kangaroos than to the
Yes. This mouse is closer to us than this is closer to a mouse, than this marsupial is closer to a mouse. These are marsupials that only have placenta. They diverged so far back, millions of years ago, but they have developed similar characteristics, similar phenotype. Why? Because of the habitat, because of the environment. They live in a similar environment. So this is called convergent evolution. It's going to become very clear when I talk about the Australian pine, okay? This is a mole, this is the European mole, and this is a marsupial, Notorictes typhlops, Notorictes typhlops. And this is a talpa, which is the mole, Talpa europea. Same adaptation, all right, but unrelated. Only related at the level of mammal, of vertebrate. The wolf and the Tasmanian wolf. Something that looks like a beaver, but it's a wombat. Down here, the anteater, less obvious, but it does have the long, sticky tongue because it feeds on ants or insects. And this is the African anteater. And this other thing that is called a native cat and a real feline. These are felines, carnivores, but this is a native cat, which is a marsupial. No relationship, and yet very similar in morphology and external morphology because of an adaptation to the particular environment. Okay?
But there's nothing that could show that they were linked together.
Yeah, the phylogenetics. We can do a genetic tree and see where they fall in the phylogenetics. If they're going to fall way back, the divergence, the common ancestor is millions of years ago at the level of different continents. Imagine. So it had to be the only convergence of these creatures is when at the level of Pangea, when the supercontinent, which what, about 140 or 220 million years ago?
Australia separated before the origin of the coming of the placenta. So that's why Australia only has marsupials.
Yeah, it's more primitive.
They were only marsupials at the time.
Exactly.
And
They are more primitive than
other
us.
marsupials, with the exception of South America, the placentas recovered in competition.
Yeah, especially when the placentas became carnivores, right? Then they started eating other marsupials that were around because they cannot compete. Okay. But this is not just with placentas or marsupials. It happens also in birds, for example, the convergent evolution thing. Here is the hummingbird that we're used to, and this one is called a honey creeper from Australia. For Hawaii, the Polynesian Islands. So this tends to be, yes, it tends to be a phenomenon of islands or that geographical isolation, right? Because the geographical isolation predisposes, if you will, for speciation. They have developed similar beaks. It is, yeah, isn't it pretty? But what they don't have in common is the humming of the hummingbird. This one rather creeps around, as the name says. It doesn't hover, okay? But the functional end of the animal is the beak, right? For the honey or the nectar has developed a similar beak, long and narrow, to get into the nectar because they are nectar eaters. So that's what's driving the evolution of these birds, is the food source. Okay, so it's another example of convergent evolution that has nothing to do with the classical one of marsupials and placentas in birds. Another one between Europe and North America and Africa, these two porcupines, which obviously Africa and the American continents diverged millions of years ago, and they both evolved porcupines independently. Interesting. These are the actual photographs. And these guys, this is not an invasive. This is not an exotic porcupine that got loose somewhere in America. It's native.
They have the same color.
Yes, coloration pattern, and even the fact that it's the back half that develops the spines because the animal will tend to be attacked from the back. So that's the area that needs more protection. Okay. Convergent evolution, amazing. Okay, it also occurs in plants. Not only in animals, it occurs in plants, the convergent evolution, and this is the opportunity to talk about this disgusting creature that we call the Australian pine. I'm sorry, but I have an aversion to it because it's taken over. It's become super invasive. It was introduced originally probably as a, even before ornamental, it was probably introduced to try to dry out what was considered to be a swamp, which is today the Everglades, okay? And, but you notice it looks like a pine. It's got the general shape of a pine, more or less, even though they can get much more scraggly than that. But certainly they have needles, don't they? Look at the little needles. No, they don't have needles. These are actually leaves. As you can see here, these are leaflets that have collapsed against the twig. And there will be anywhere from 7 to 12 of these little leaflets around each twig. And the leaflets have collapsed there for a reason that I'll tell you in a minute. And so when we have twig after twig in a long fashion, it looks like a needle, looks like a needle, but it's not a real needle. And the reason is, the proof is that a real needle is a single structure from the base to the tip, whereas these guys are segmented like that. I always forget to bring some in, but it's very, you can, whenever next time you go by, they break, they are segmented in discrete places, and they're breaking between one twig and another. So why this adaptation? Well, if I tell you why, the further adaptation, this, you're going to admit, that's a cone, right? That's a cone. No, it's not a cone, it's a flower. It's a very woody flower. That's the flower of, this is a flower pod. These are individual flowers, okay, but this is the pod, and it's the female structure. This is possibly the male structure, I'm not sure. But the point is that this flower is become very woody, right? But inside there will be ova to be fertilized by pollen, which is the universal thing for plants. And the seeds are also airborne seeds, very similar to actual seeds, airborne seeds, winged seeds of the conifers. So even down to the level of the seed, it has undergone parallel or convergent evolution to real conifers. But they're not conifers at all. The Australian pine, that's why I put it in quotations, they are angiosperms, they are deciduous trees. So why all these adaptations that now, when we compare this to a real deciduous tree or a normal deciduous tree, it looks extreme because of the extreme environment in which they live, basically a very dry environment. A very dry environment in Australia, because Australia, yeah, it's nice and fertile around the rim, but the center of Australia is just one big desert, okay? And so they have adapted to that environment. Yes, I did mean that. See if I can.
It's like a mini Earth.
Yes, yes. They're interested in mini Earth. This is what I want. This is an actual satellite view, all right? This is not a painting or a drawing. Some satellite took this picture some time ago. Pretty big, and that's why it's a continent, not an island. But you can see that the center is the great desert of Australia. Exactly, and only green around the edge, all right? Now, to keep it in context, here's the rest of the globe. Yeah, see, just by the eye, could be as large as India, not larger. That's Australia.
Right.
This is India here, the India subcontinent. Saudi Arabia, look at Africa, is not that much smaller than Africa. There's Australia, maybe 1/4 of the size of Africa. With South America. Here's South America, Australia, South America. Maybe 3 South Americas, go away. Maybe 3 or 4 Australias will make a South America. So it's a continent. But it's mostly dry in the middle. And so these trees have adapted supremely to that dry environment. But what really, how we can tell definitively it's not a conifer, is if we look at the root system, which is below ground and therefore hidden to us in plain sight, but we see that they don't have a taproot. Definitely they have secondary roots and very shallow roots. In fact, you can see them, they're totally intolerant to salt water. And yet if you go, for example, Key Biscayne along the shore, in the Caribbean, in the islands, when we lived in Cuba, there was one of these outside our home. They can be right up to the shoreline. Maybe just in 1 foot of soil, rocky, sandy soil, and all the root system is in that 1 foot, expanded, because they don't tolerate salt water, and they're right above the high water mark of the salt water. A root plate, exactly, huge like that. Let's see if they have Australian root plates. Casuarina. Their scientific name is Casuarina. I think there are 6 species. And that's why they are a problem when they topple over. When they topple over, that whole root plate comes out of the ground like that, and it's a horrible disruptor of the soil there.
Do you know how they got here?
From Australia, I don't know exactly. Is it known, Luis, how they got here? Was it agriculture or was
I
it?
think that similar to the Maluka, as you said, to drain the swamp.
For draining?
Well, Melaleuca was
also,
definitely planted
It
to.
was used as a wind curtain.
Yeah,
Wind
I know,
curtain
I
or
mean, Melaleuca was definitely planted in the Everglades to dry up. I mean, specifically Broward, governor, had
Yes.
brought in Melaleuca plants, but I wasn't sure of the Australian pine.
It was brought to the New World for curtain, wind curtain.
A wind
and
curtain.
Also for drying, they tolerate flooding pretty well as well. So you will see it interspersed with the Maluka in the swamp.
And now that I'm remembering, I was told that at some point they were also introduced for logging, because they tend to grow fast. And the idea is that their wood, because they didn't evolve here, the wood would be resistant to the local bugs, termites and stuff like that.
I took a workshop down at
Yeah.
Fairchild.
Yeah.
And they were talking about these trees and they said, even if they're chopped down, when the trunk falls on the ground, they emit some kind of a toxin into the soil that prevents other plants from growing there.
Yes. Yes.
Yes.
Like,
Most of the
look at
invasives,
this.
they get around with it because of that allelopathic effect. The sea pepper does the same.
Oh, yeah.
So
Yes.
it prevents the other plants. It cannot release the
Right.
stunter of the other plants and prevent them from growing. And of course, the invasive plant surpasses in size.
There's like a tree next to FIU.
Yes.
That whole marsh.
Yes.
area.
Yes, we call that disturbed or contaminated. The Australian pine, they're ubiquitous. They're all over the place.
All the spoiled islands that we have.
Spoiled islands,
Wherever
right?
you move the vegan for canals, stuff, they colonize that right away.
Yeah,
So
they grew.
successful.
This is what I was looking for. So I remember that this is at Bear Cut, Crandon Park. And when Andrew came through and knocked down a lot of these, then Key Biscayne decided to finish the job and eradicate the Australian pine from Key Biscayne and particularly Cape Florida at the tip park. But now it's coming back. It's coming back because you have to stay on top of it. They're very invasive that way. And we have a strand here that is slowly but surely invading. And you're right, they also have vegetative propagation. So they put out little shoots from the root system way out. And when the root gets an insult, gets cut or something like that, the remaining stump will put out little shoots of new Australian pines. It is nasty. Sorry? Only fresh water, yes. Doesn't tolerate salt water. Yeah.
We have two here, main two species here in South
You
Florida.
too? Yes?
One is more into the wet environment. They say Equisetifolia. It's the
Equisetifolia.
one that grows even taller. But
Mhm.
in the mainland, in the higher ground,
Yes?
we have the one that is called the suckering Australian pine.
Oh, yes?
This is the one that forms that clump that you
Oh,
mentioned,
yes?
and it reproduces like crazy around
Very
the
fast.
main tree.
By vegetative
Like a
propagation.
Yeah.
Mhm.
propagation.
There's
See?
like an animal that makes like a noise in that tree.
Oh, yes?
Hear like a
Could be the cycads. Could be cicadas.
I thought that was
Cicadas.
the tree itself, but
Now the tree does have a nice, when the wind flows through the tree, it does make a swish sound. I've heard that, and that is pretty. I've heard it here when there's a strand of the Australian pine. That is pretty, but that's about the only redeeming thing they have as far as I'm concerned. The actual tree itself is just super aggressive. Look at that. It's amazing. It's just literally hanging on by the tips of the root. So anyway, that's convergent evolution. Happens not only in animals, it happens in plants. This one last is to point out, for example, the eye has developed many times in evolutionary history in many species independently. This is obviously a human eye. This is a fly eye, which is compound eye. Each one of these is an eyelid, and it forms like a mosaic picture. But if we were to try to swat the fly and catch a fly, we know that the eye does work. This is a flatworm, which has eyelets, which can only detect like darkness, light and dark areas, okay? Certainly no particular color or anything like that. But it's an independent, this is a flatworm, the planaria, very distantly related to the fly or to the human. Here's a mollusk. This is a shell, a bivalve, a clam type. These are single eyes, but many of them, dozens, on the upper lip and on the lower lip. Okay, again, they're just basically sensitive to light and maybe motion. Developed independently in all these different species, the same basic function, all right, which is to detect motion, to detect light, and so forth. Okay, so with that, I'm finishing here. So this is about adaptiveness. Basically, overall, we can see that every species that we see today looks adapted to its environment, all right? And at plain sight, it would seem that it's perfectly adapted, but not perfectly. It's generally as adapted as it needs to be in order to survive, all right? But those adaptations have been driven by change, typically environmental change, and the drastic change is what can lead to what we call massive extinction, and then that opens up niches, places that are now uninhabited, which are open for new species to arise and flourish, and that typically is known as an expansive radiation, that cycle. As far as evolutionary biologists can tell, there have been 5 of these cycles of massive extinction with expansive radiations.
Have you thought about the dinosaurs and the extinction of the dinosaurs? How is it possible that the entire group disappeared? How was that possible? How is that none of them survived?
Runaway, well, the ancestor, the descendants survive, basically many other reptiles, right? But I think what happened to the dinosaurs is a runaway evolution. They got so aggressive, the competition was so intense that they had to get more fierce, more teeth, more aggression. And it made them so adapted to the particular environment that when this catastrophic thing happened, supposedly this meteorite that fell near Yucatan and so forth, and the change was too drastic for them. First, the herbivore dinosaurs were lost, and they were feeding, and the carnivore dinosaurs had become so voracious that they needed a lot of those herbivores to keep them alive, which made the herbivore dinosaurs larger and larger to survive the aggression of the carnivores. But then that meant that those herbivore dinosaurs had to feed on more and more plants and become larger and larger. So to me, it's a runaway evolution, what happened with the dinosaurs. And while the environment was going on, and there was still plenty, it was a tropicalized Earth, there was warmth on Earth, and there was plenty of sunlight and plenty of water. The plants was the basic material. Remember the 10-to-1 ratio of the pyramid, going from one trophic level to the next, all right? There was plenty of raw material to keep that in the tropicalized Earth, to keep all those animals alive. But when that changed and the Earth clouded over with a cloud that lasted several years, there went the plants. There go the plants, there go the herbivores. There go the herbivores, there go the carnivores. And only the little ones managed because they could get by scraping some little kind of food. It's what we call the ancestors of the lizards of today, or snakes, whatever.
That makes sense.
Remember, it's an inference, okay? It's an inference, but it makes sense. It makes biological sense. It makes evolutionary sense if we put it in a context. Okay? Thank you very much. I think we've gone through chapter 7 more or less. I kind of whacked at it. You can take a look also. And so the basic thing here is adaptedness. It's a big point for Meyer, and it was a big point for Darwin. The whole idea that this adaptedness leads to variation, variance within a particular species, and then selection is going to act on those variants. All right, thank you very much. I'm gonna wrap it up, and I'll be sending you this shortly. Okay, Adam, thanks a lot. Oh,
Can you just do what you just said again?
yeah, okay, so
Variance.
what did I say?
Var-
Right,
variance.
so adaptedness leads to variance. Variant individuals within the same species, right? Adaptedness leads to variance. And then selection is the playing ground of selection, because now selection can select on those variants, depending on the particular environmental conditions. So selection will act on the variants. Some variants are better adapted than others. For example, turtles. We're talking about the painted turtle, all right, North American painted turtle, but the one that has a thicker carapace of the turtle is going to be more resistant to UV light, will have less mutations. Just to give an example of a variant within a species on which selection is acting, because that UV is coming down all the time. They need to go out and sun themselves because they're cold-blooded, and when they're in the water, water tends to draw heat from them, so they periodically need to come out on the log and sun themselves, but they're exposed to UV. So I'm just kind of thinking out loud here, the one with a thicker, what do you call the carapace of the turtle?
Shell.
The shell will be more resistant to, same
The
example.
adaptation gives way to the variance, and then the variance, basically selection, picks
Are
from the
subject to
variant.
selection, yeah.
Okay.
In the human, melanin. Melanin from tropicalized equatorial Africa to northern Scandinavia. The sun is coming at a larger incidence, less UV, especially UVA, which is the one that's more cancer causing. So less need for melanin over millions of years, or even just thousands of years. Babies born with less melanin manage to survive, but they manage to survive away from the tropics. All right, thank you very much. We'll see
Bye.
you. Okay, bye, Ada, thanks.